Hi everybody, my name is Paris Purnell and I work in Global Clinical Education at Hollister Incorporated. Today I am joined with Kim Smitka from Global Clinical Education as well from Hollister, and Greg Sapluski, who's the Senior Lead Engineer and New Product Development at Hollister Incorporated. Recently they co-authored an article around convexity that's published in the WCET journal in 2024, all around convexity and evidence generation. So today I'll be asking them a few questions about their journal article, and we'll get some insights as to where they're thinking about the evidence in terms of how it's going to impact new product development, as well as impact clinical practices. My first question is to Greg. Now, Greg, this article in 2024 builds on another article that was previously done in 2021, titled The Characteristics of Convex Skin Barriers and Clinical Application, which generated a lot of thought-provoking discussions with clinicians. Since then, how has this helped you move forward to new product concepts? And what is different in this new article compared with that of the 2021?
It's a great question, Paris. So in the 2021 article, it really acted as a Rosetta Stone, bridging the gap in communication between how clinicians talk about convexity and how engineers like myself talk about convexity. So prior to 2021, when we were looking at concepts, we would call them soft convexity or firm convexity, which are truly marketing terms. So these add value, but they're insufficient in trying to describe the concept fully. So since this publication, we were able to use these 5 characteristics when talking about our product concepts, and that allows us to get more valuable feedback from clinicians and make sure that the product we develop is going to add value to that patient. When it comes to the 2024 publication, what's different about that is we're moving beyond the definition of the characteristics, and we're moving toward measurement of the characteristics. So with the 5 characteristics, I tend to group them into 2 different buckets. We have slope, depth, and tension location, and those 3 are static characteristics, or characteristics that are readily apparent simply by looking at the product. In contrast, we have dynamic characteristics like flexibility and compressibility. These characteristics require a more in-depth approach when analyzing them. So they have a time-based component, which means we need to put them on the skin of the end user in order to understand exactly how the product will perform.
I think it's really interesting when you're talking about the marketing terminology around soft and firm. And we've often used a lot of, conflicting information or descriptors, which does confuse clinicians. We hear different types of terminology such as light, firm, deep, soft, moderate, etc. But they're all such subjective terms. And that's really one of the challenges, I think, that is inherent in what we're discussing lately. I think it's really important that these 5 characteristics really lay out that nomenclature as you just described, really getting us all on the same terminology. I think that's really, an important point that we need to make. So Kim, I think what I wanted to ask you about the characteristics, very similar to Greg. You were on the original article with Greg as well around about the 5 characteristics. What do you see as different in 2021 for you?
I think that this newer article in 2024 shifts the clinical focus from looking at the individual characteristics to now exploring how all 5 characteristics interact to provide a really good seal. Historically, clinicians have really focused on one characteristic, for example, depth, perhaps. And now, in reality, we understand that it's an interaction of all 5 characteristics that work together to get a really good fit for the patient, a secure seal, and better outcomes.
I couldn't agree more. I see oftentimes when I have conversations with clinicians, they focus only on that one aspect, and quite often it is depth. How deep is your product? And really, that's just one piece, and how they all fit together is such a critical component. And I find now we're already having these different conversations based on not just one attribute. It should be all taken as a whole. So that 5-piece interplay is really what we're talking about here in terms of what's being different. Do you find conversations that you're having with clinicians now around convexity is a little bit more robust now that we have a common terminology or nomenclature to talk through?
Absolutely. I think having a common terminology has given the clinicians more confidence, and it's just opened the door to those more robust conversations. So for example, there are a lot of clinicians who are mentoring younger stoma care nurses, and they now feel that something that they've been doing for many years based on their clinical experience very intuitive. Now they have the terminology to articulate what they're doing to new stoma care nurses. And in addition to that, it's really exciting to go to conferences now because, as you mentioned, the conversation has changed. And when people get up and present a case study or maybe a very challenging patient, they're using the 5 characteristics to really explain why they chose that convex product. I needed a more flexible barrier to really conform to the abdominal contours, or I needed something that was easily compressible because the abdominal tone was so firm. So these are great conversations that we're having, and it really does stem from having a common terminology.
I love what you're saying there. It's really putting that art into science. We've often talked about how do we get what's in a clinician's mind because they've got such great experience. They can evaluate a patient quickly and then select a product for that. But how do they transfer that knowledge to the next generation of stoma care nurses? And so having this common terminology, you're able to have those great conversations. But it really is a great educational opportunity, I think, as well, to take to our clinicians who are coming up through the ranks so that you're all saying the same things and it means the same thing as well. We're getting rid of that subjectivity. I think that's fantastic. Greg, back to you. You mentioned in your article, human-centered design. I'm just wondering a little bit more about that because I found that a really fascinating topic. How does that influence new product development and how does that help with future research as well?
So human-centered design is a design philosophy that focuses on the end user or the patient as that number one priority. We also want to make sure that we're solving the right problem. So there's a couple tools that we use within this human-centered design to help us evaluate that. First, we have observational studies. So an observational study is going to have the end user with their current product in their native environment. So that could be within their home. And they're just going to use the product how they normally would. And then we as researchers are going to observe their interactions. So that helps us to understand what does current product usage look like and what are the behaviors of that end user. Second, we have usability studies. So in usability studies, we can give that end user a new product that might have some new features or something different about it. And then we're going to evaluate how they interact with that new product to better understand how the feature is working for them. So is it easy to use? Is it intuitive? So those two tools combined together are a great approach to make sure that we're focused on that end user more so than just perhaps other parameters like manufacturability or cost.
That's a really good point. I love the human-centered approach of bringing that patient into the center, which is really what we're trying to do. When you hear a clinician such as Kim explaining how this supports clinical practice, do you think this design approach really extends beyond patients and helps us to drive to better practices around convexity?
Absolutely. So within R&D, we're truly focused on that patient, that end user. And I believe that the clinician feels exactly the same way. They're truly focused on that end user. So working together, R&D and the clinician, I believe we can both work together to drive those practices moving forward and get better outcomes for our patients.
I love that energy around trying to create a relationship between industry and clinicians because it is a really valid point. We should not be working in isolation. Clinical and industry should be partnering together because that's going to help really achieve some optimal outcomes for our patients. Kim, as a WOCN yourself, how do you see these recent articles changing the landscape in ostomy care? What are you seeing driving real clinical change?
Now that we have all this evidence, it's up to us as stoma care nurses to really take that and apply it to our clinical practice and report out on the outcomes. I think about what I was saying to you earlier about trial and error and how really the goal of any pouching system is to get a secure, reliable, and predictable seal for the patient. Yet many nurses, that's not what's happening. And it goes back to what I said about trial and error. And they're having a lot of leakage, and they've just started to accept that that is the norm, where patients are going to have leakage. And using convexity is going to be trial and error. But I think now we have enough evidence that leakage should now become the exception rather than the rule. And so what that looks like is clinicians really applying all of the evidence we have around convexity today to the clinical practice and getting more, not only a secure, reliable, predictable seal, but secure, reliable, predictable outcomes for the patients.
No, as you were saying that, something just popped into my mind as well. I think, this new common terminology that we're all using and starting to use now from a clinical perspective, that could also lend itself to future research because we're now using similar terminology, and it's going to be easier to do the research, to your point, and build on what we already have. So I think that that's also another component in there as well. So I think that this has a great lot of opportunity for future evidence building. I want to thank you both for a really informative session. I think this has been really helpful in getting us a little bit of a dissection around the actual journal article. I urge anybody who's interested in learning more about convexity, pick up this journal article or reach out to us, and we'll be able to supply you with some information from it. And it will help you with your clinical decision making in the future around convex product decisions. Thank you for listening.